Welcome to the Make School Great Again podcast, where we challenge the status quo in education and cast a bold kingdom vision for the next generation. I'm Kale, and I'm here with my co-host James. And today, episode 2, we explore the Gen Z faith crisis, a silent crisis not born out of rebellion, but of spiritual undernourishment. So our topic today, it's a big one.
Yeah.
Lots of people talking about this topic online, and I think it's a very relevant conversation to be having. Some of the stats that we've posted ourselves are the following. 4% hold a biblical worldview.
Yeah, wow.
58% Gen Z say morals are subjective. And, we look at the time that's spent on screens, per day, 6 to 9 hours versus less than 10 minutes in scripture. It's a new time in history to be alive. And looking at some of this data that's come through, like we say, from America, but I think very much relevant in our context in Australia here. What's your first reaction to some of those stats, James, from, I guess, more of the glass half full perspective? We will look at the other side, but
I think numbers alone are quite significant when you think what 4% hold a biblical worldview, and we're sort of thinking about what is this in comparison to, and it's very much a comparison to Christendom and the Western culture that was very much built upon a Christian worldview, and to say that only 4% hold that Christian worldview today is sort of mind-boggling. The whole fact about what we're focusing on, this, it's not out of this rebellion, but this spiritual undernourishment. I think most of society would argue that it was, they're rebelling or they're going against the norms of the societal norms, or it wasn't like this in our days, they're just rebelling. But I think you've hit the nail on the head exactly there. When we look at these percentages, the statistics that are here, it's actually, that spiritual undernourishment. It's just not part of society and where we stand, our grounds, our morals, our virtues anymore.
Yes, and we see that God's been kicked out of the classroom and in institutions everywhere. So it shouldn't be a surprise, really, when you look at that happening. But I'm going to say, there are some positive trends and opportunities happening. So some more stats. Despite these challenges, we actually have 64% of Gen Z report having prayed to God in the past week, and 77% of US teens, express motivation to learn more about Jesus, which I think is really interesting. And the last one here is over half of Gen Z Christians, 57%, prioritize building relationships over attending sermons, indicating a preference for genuine connections within faith communities. So
there's a definite increase. I think something that I've been most encouraged by, sort of even in my own social media scrolling, because that's where we often go to for that downtime or the mindlessness, is to see some of this increase in this younger generation that are actually searching to an extent or finding this connection. And I think that's worth looking into. What is the authenticity of that? What's the genuineness of that? What does that look like? But to hear that, from a statistic point of view, and also to hear that we're also sort of noticing there's this relationship or this curiosity around that, and that there is this prioritizing around relationship building and this faith building. I think, there's something to say here and something to definitely delve deeper into.
Yeah, so it's not all doom and gloom. It's almost like, despite the state, it's having a reaction where we're seeing these communities, and even across different universities, there's faith communities popping up, and there's a response to, I guess, the bill of goods that have been sold that, are coming up short. They're empty. They're empty lies based on a secular worldview. And I feel like there's this reaction that's like, what? This isn't fulfilling. I'm not feeling connected, or it's just anxiety and fear being pushed all the time. And so it is having some kind of effect on teens today, which is really encouraging. I did want to, continue this on by looking at 3 particular verses that will help shape, I guess, an underlying foundation of what we believe about should be the way that, I guess, our students and our children today are building their foundation on. And the first verse is Psalm, and this goes for parents. I should probably say parents as well. Psalm 78, 5-8. James, do you want to take that for us? Read it through, and then we'll break it down and have a chat about it.
Yeah, sure. So Psalm 78, 5-7. So we're reading from the New American Standard Version. So, for he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers that they were to teach them to their children, so that the generation to come would know the children yet to be born, and that they would arise and tell them to their children, so that they would put their confidence in God and not forget the works of God, but comply to his commandments, and not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that did not prepare its heart and whose spirit was not faithful to God. Yeah, wow.
So it raises an obvious question in today's climate where is there a teaching legacy lost amongst the parent and the children relationship? You know, are we handing this off to schools, or have we handed this off to schools for so long now that now this is the reaction we're seeing, where there's just a low literacy of biblical understanding? But I think it's quite remarkable that, you know, this does remind us that God appoints parents to pass down truth. And so when that's not happening, it only takes one generation to really forget those foundational truths. So that's the current climate and the crisis, I guess, we're saying exists. And so, you know, it is true. We are looking at a culture that can memorize different trends on TikTok other than scripture, or even know more about scripture itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, what have you seen from that perspective?
Yeah, I think like initially I think it's more so out of ignorance, right? Where it's not the family or the parents have sort of gone like, you know, I'm intentionally not teaching my children a biblical worldview, or taking, you know, responsibility for their upbringing, you know, the way that they should go as such. In the home, I think it's the ignorance or the lack of understanding, or the just too much trust in the school system that, you know, we talked about it last week, has our children for 35 plus hours a week. That there's just too much trust in, especially in faith-based schools, where parents have said, hey, you know, I know they go to a faith-based school, they're going to get that discipleship, that nurturing, their sort of preparedness, preparing them for a relationship with God. But it's very much the responsibility of what's happening in the home.
Yes. And it often raises the question is what are the essential rhythms that are actually slipping through the cracks? Like if it's being outsourced to schools out of the genuine thought that they're going to be able to do a good job, are they? One. And two, you know, what's being missed in that? I'm going to read another verse for us today. It's from Colossians 2:8, and it says, "See to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to human tradition, in accordance with the elementary principles of the world, rather than according to Christ."
Yeah.
So,
I think, yeah, wow. So for me, I think this one, when you think about in particular, some of like, especially in America, some of these top institutions, these higher education institutions, when you're thinking about your Oxford and you're thinking about Yale, they were built on Christian biblical theology, biblical worldview. And then, yeah, to see Colossians, don't captive through philosophy and empty deception. Like where have these institutions, I know that's sort of a bit higher than what we're talking about when it comes to sort of making school great again, but it's a flow and effect from what's happening at that higher level as well, where that's forming worldview. And so as much, that's also so evident inside of, you know, the schools you and I have worked in, that it's this philosophy of thought, this worldview that's sort of being embedded into curriculum, into ethos, even that is sort of turning away from Christ, whether it be intentionally or whether it just be there's not that solid enough foundation in that true biblical worldview.
yeah, and I think the question is for Christian schools today, I think it's a good thing to reflect upon is, okay, how much of what we're doing is from a perspective that is, you know, human tradition. It's you know, philosophy and empty deception. Like how much of the world is actually infiltrating and shaping the way that the school is run and how they're implementing different programs and they're arranging their lessons to teach on certain topics. Because with this high-tech world now where everyone's connected and social media and algorithms and feeds, it almost can feel like the feeds are the things that are shaping worldview, as opposed to foundational truth in scripture, grounded in scripture. And so I think that's a really important thing to consider when we're looking at, well, yeah, how are worldviews being shaped today? Well, a lot of it is those algorithms and feeds, because we know that they pick up on things that you spend time looking at and they feed you other things. And so if worldview's being, I guess, collected in little 15-second bites, you know, how are we going to recapture that depth over dopamine? which we're seeing in classrooms. All right, last Bible verse I wanted to look at, 2 Timothy 3:14-15 says, knowing from whom you have learned them, and that from childhood you have known the sacred writings, which are able to give you the wisdom that leads to salvation through faith which is in Christ Jesus. So again, there's this idea that, if we look at today, kids are spending up to 9 hours a day. They're staring at screens and much less in God's word. How do we help families pivot from this passive consumption to that more purpose-driven discipleship? Because it says that from childhood, you have known the sacred writings, which is, and that's worldview formation. It's an understanding of actually real wisdom that leads to salvation. At the end of the day, that's the Christian mission in schooling, is to be able to present the gospel in a way that, the students understand and in time grow in that wisdom that leads to salvation. So what do you think schools can be doing, and maybe even in the home too, to go from that passive consumption of social media to more purpose-driven discipleship?
Yeah, I think before I jump into that, I think the sort of preceding that is the whole idea of, we're talking about development. We're talking about the whole concept of, so in here, Timothy, we're talking about you're stuck in, or you continue in the things that you've learned. If we're talking about cognitive development or brain development, that's happening up until 90% of the brain at 5 years old, right? Those formative years. And then in those sort of 5 to 15, the influence is the majority of the influence is who has the child's direct attention, right? Is it the parent? Is it the school? Is it social media? And then from there, 15 onwards is sort of the age where, I used to work at a couple of schools, and, this is the year 9 age group, 15-year-olds, where everyone doesn't want to teach year 9. And so why is that? Well, there's this next sort of developmental stage where they're grappling with the things that they've learned from 5 to 15. They're trying to go up against it and try to work it out for themselves so that they can get this ownership themselves. And so if we're thinking about these sort of developmental stages, we're talking about, what's happening inside of the home in those really influential 90% of the brain development type of years, in those formative years up until 5. So what's happening there, and how quickly are, kids getting into the system through daycares, or what's happening at the home in those times from a consumption point of view. That 5 to 15, those sort of learning years where we're exploring and students are learning from their main influences. Who are those main influences, and what's happening inside the home? But for most of families, what's happening inside of the school? That everything that they come to know to be true, and this is what Second Timothy is talking about here, come to know to be true, is what then they take with them and then they walk with. And sure, at that 15, they're either grappling with that, and they do one of two things: they solidify, and it's pretty much what they know then, and that's where they go with it, or they're rebelling against it, or coming up to that countering. So I think understanding the development of student thinking, cognitive development in that way, or child, is to go, all right, how are we coming alongside as Christians, as people who understand a biblical worldview and the importance of that, to go, how are we setting them up with those formative years? What's the learning that's happening between that 5 to 15 that really provides that solid foundation, that when they get to that 15 and want to work things out for themselves, that they've got such a solid, firm foundation from a biblical lens, a biblical worldview, that they're not going to turn from it. And it informs how they make those future more crucial decisions as they come into that adulthood.
Yeah, and you've nailed it. And I think that it's really important to look at it in those developmental stages. And as you were talking, I was thinking about, the opposing agendas at play, whether it's from religious perspectives or ideological perspectives. They all know that, to win over a generation, you've got to go for the kids. And that's, it's true in what we're doing, because we recognize the importance of teaching children those foundational truths. However, I guess the enemy is very good at duplicating and copying that approach. And they know too, if they can get in early at those younger ages, then they'll have a much more higher successful rate of, confusing them as they get older. So it is a battle for the hearts and minds, and different parties are aware of that. And so, what we see is very much a spiritual battle, at a deeper level. But one of my favorite authors on this topic on worldview development is Dr. Roger C.S. Erdvig. And when I was just coming out of my time working in a private school and looking at how successful they were in shaping a worldview, actually from not a biblical worldview, in my opinion, but from more of a humanist, globalist perspective, I began to ask questions and start thinking about what is it that I can do to have some influence or impact here where we're actually not following this status quo that the UN has essentially set out and through soft policy pushing managed to be able to start shaping the minds of our children in Australian classrooms. Like it's a thing. If you want to look up the UN sustainability goals in their educational program, through programs like IB, that's how they're doing it. But out of that, I found this gentleman who was essentially speaking my language. I felt it was somebody at that time where I thought he actually has a really good grasp of what biblical worldview immersion and formation implies. And he says this, says at every level, we can help our students learn to process experiences in ways that will prepare them for the critical years of biblical worldview development. It starts with creating opportunities for our students to experience new things. And so he goes on to say that those things are conversations with peers, reflection, study, and being mentored. But he makes the note that it's not just mentoring in that, I'm sort of the expert on everything and I'm just going to tell you what's true. It's effective mentoring involves asking great questions that prompt the other person to probe for meaning in the new experiences and then serving others. Through that, it actually made me reflect on the programs that we have and how that's occurring. You're working with the 15 to 17-year-olds. How would you say each of those points, I guess, comes through in the work that you're spending with them each week?
Yeah, great. Yeah, I think with great intention, actually. So the whole idea of our 15 to 17-year-old age group and knowing just based on the previous sort of the topic we're talking about, those developmental ages and the information, our programs for that 15 to 17-year-old are very much about knowing that this is the age that kids start to question things and want to question things and should be able to question things and have a critical lens on the world and what's going on in the world. And so our intention is to allow that and to actually foster that and do it in a way that is through a biblical lens and to be completely open and honest about, what have we done well and what hasn't been done well and how does that then point back to the Bible and the biblical truth. And so that is built on, firstly, conversation with the students that are in that class. And so what are their current truth? What do they currently know? And knowing that we've started our unit saying, these are our current authorities. It's church, it's our parents, maybe for some of them it's teachers if they were in a classroom or, direct family or friends, right? So, but then bringing those different perspectives to our conversation inside of our classroom and then sort of discussing, what are some of those different perspectives that we have? Why do we have that? Do we question it? How do we know? And then how do we come to that real source of truth? And do we need to, have we been told or informed correctly from a biblical lens, or is there things that we need to sort of grapple with ourselves, which brings us into that reflection, right? It's so looking at that self-reflection. It's looking inwardly and looking at the experiences of others to compare and contrast, and knowing that everybody has their own different reflection.
Yeah. Yes. No, go on. Sorry, I interrupted you early.
I know. No, I was just going to say, then from there, we jump into then the study element, right? And that's where we grapple with the content and we look at the content. And our first unit was, how do we know? So we go to knowledge claims and where is our source of truth? Where is knowledge? How do we look at knowledge? Now we're looking at, a critical lens of Christianity through history. And we look at what has happened historically, what has happened, what has influenced that, what's true, and does it align with the Bible? So we've looked at, the transatlantic slave trade, or we've looked at sort of the church under Nazi rule, etc. How does that align or not align to a biblical lens, and why? Does that play in tune as such with Jesus? And allowing the students to deal with that and question that and look into that.
No, it's great, and I think that's the type of environment that fosters that worldview development, because it's not like everyone's entering the classroom at that same level of understanding. They're all coming from different backgrounds, possibly different experiences through childhood, through schooling, through friendships, through mentorships, and they're bringing all of those things. So it's like this, it's not something that, once you just kind of hop into the biblical worldview stream, it's all just sequential. No, there's a lot of wrestling and formation of challenge and reflecting and processing, which needs to take place. And I think more importantly, needs to be given space to take place. And when that doesn't happen, and we see this in the school system, it's just, here's what's true, just believe it. Don't think about it, just this is what you need to know. And so, a maturing worldview, I think it's something, and this goes for myself. It's not that, I've reached this point where I have a biblical worldview now. No, it's always it's active, it's dynamic, and it's something that we need to be aware of, first of all. So if the students are aware that they have a worldview, that's the first thing. And how that connects and aligns with God's view of reality, really important. The second thing, meaningful processing, like you said. So having those conversations, allowing students to share, listen to those different perspectives, and then also having the ownership to go, no, I'm in charge of this. I'm not somebody that just receives information passively and just accepts it. I need to be someone that then goes and finds this information out further. And even as adults, I think that's something that can be applied outside of the learning space that our children are in.
Yeah, most certainly.
I'm going to skip to our next segment, which is, the question is, how do parents disciple beyond Sunday? And I guess this is framed from the perspective of, let's say families have their children in school. What are some of those things that parents and families can be doing to not just have it for that Sunday moment where they get that couple of hours where they might be getting some really good stuff and teaching? We talk about daily rhythms that should be part of the day. We've all heard of morning devotions, family discussion at the dinner table, maybe possibly even getting into some mentorship groups and things like that. What are some of the other things you see as being, I guess, that should just be part of the default bag of tools that you take into each week? Because you're somebody, you have 5 kids. There's a lot of moving parts. And so what are some of the things you do that, I guess, help counter even just that screen saturation with technology and the different tools we're using today?
Yeah, great question, and a lot different sort of angles to look at it. So yeah, I've got 5 kids. Mm-hmm. And ages ranging from the youngest being 5, the eldest being 13. So for us, the day in, day out, firstly, and then maybe the why. So our older kids, typically as part of their schooling, their homeschooling, it always will start with some form of personal devotion. And sometimes that's my wife, Jennifer, sitting down with them and doing it, or they've got it as part of, that's step 1 on them completing their learning for the day. So they've got that devotional, and they've got their own devotional books that they sort of work through, and that's age appropriate. That's usually gender appropriate. So Noah, my son, has one for boys. The girls sort of share one together. In that, my wife and I, we come together, and there's that visual time throughout the morning at some point, whenever we can find a moment between setting kids up for homeschool or between meetings, we sit down in sight of our children and we do our devotions together. So they might be doing their schooling, or they might be playing at that point in time, but they also see from what are their parents doing, that they take time and prioritize doing devotion together. And so sometimes they join us and sit with us. Sometimes, they'll come and pray together. And usually from there, we'll go and we'll put on some family worship, and we'll listen to a song or two, usually one that they're doing at church and they know the actions or they know whatever it is. So we'll do some worship together, and then the kids will go on, depending on their age group, either back to school sort of learning stuff, when I say homeschool learning stuff, and then, or, they might be playing or whatever it is. The curriculum that our kids do is KTA, right? And so it is a biblical worldview curriculum. And so it's not just that they're going to do some learning in an area and then they've tapped on their Bible at the beginning of the session, or, we've done our family worship. It's their whole biblical lens and worldview is embedded into it. And even prior to KTA, when Jennifer would write all their programs, it was taught by Jennifer and embedding that in every component. And regardless of if we were using Australian curriculum or the New South Wales curriculum in Australia at the time, every learning opportunity, because Jennifer was there and the kids are asking questions, could have a lens
Mm.
of a biblical worldview embedded or connected to it. I think one of the main things that we have opportunity for and we miss, and we've got 5, and so sometimes it's not always peace, and there's not always the sort of perfection with they hang out really well and play really well together.
Butterflies and
Yeah, that's it.
yeah.
Well, I think one of the other opportunities of what we do in building this biblical lens is that that's also then embedded into our discipline, and it's also embedded into, all right, well, let's look at perspectives and let's listen, and how do we come to working out the coming to peace again through a biblical lens, and what is the right way of doing that, and whether that be forgiveness or the being quick to listen, slow to speak, and just making that part of the dialogue, the daily dialogue, when it comes to correction or discipline or
Yes.
reminding sort of good interaction between our children. And as a joke, often I'll be like, remember we love Jesus, or what if Jesus was like,
Yeah.
it's just, a little sort of play thing usually from the background that I'm in like my room and I can hear the kids and I call out, is everybody loving Jesus? Right? So it's just like a little playful
Yes.
reminder, but it's also because part of our day in, day out is also sort of, okay, from a discipline or a correcting, that is also embedded. There's a why behind it, and it's all the why is always that biblical lens. So I think not only is worship and prayer embedded into day in, day out, obviously it's also embedded into curriculum and learning opportunities, regardless of if you're using KTA, which it's done already, or you're using your own sort of approach to home learning in some way, shape, or form. Or if your kids are at school, like, hey, what did you learn today? And then you've got an avenue to speak into whatever they're learning at school with a biblical lens, and then as well as sort of right living and discipline and correction as well. And then we finish every night doing Bible. We're watching Superbook at the moment, little 27-minute episodes, and then we sing the little song at the end, pray together, everybody prays, and then head off to bed from there.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I mean, and that is a picture of what I think the Bible talks about when it says, from morning to night. It's something that you are teaching and modeling as they wake up and when they go to bed. And so how much of that time is being done by somebody else or an institution, especially in those formative years, I think is a really important question and powerful question. I think a lot of parents, when they think about it, actually realize the weight of that responsibility. And, this is just a way to do this, but with our KTA program, we have these display cards that frame the learning into its framework and what are the concepts, what's the big picture statement. And I encourage families to put them up, not because I want just KTA branding in their house, but
that's
it's more
the reason.
It's a way to foster conversation. It's a way for families to engage in what they're learning and ask questions and say, oh, here's a word that came up the other day, or actually, can I add this word to the wall? And so it becomes something that is just part of the daily conversation, not something that is, oh, you're doing your learning. I don't really actually know what they're doing.
Yeah.
But they're learning, and it's actually just like the air we breathe. It's something that's being discussed fluidly. And like you said, I think it's so important to think that it's not this perfect thing that just happens and everyone gets along, and there's going to be derailers, right? Back to worldview. And whether that's, stress, distractions, trials and pain and all these things. But again, those are the moments too that I think help shape worldview, because the way your children see you react and respond to those things also is shaping how, they react. And will react as adults a lot of the time. So super important. Our next section I wanted to get into was, I'm going to call it Around the Grounds in Christian Education. And we did mean to do this last week.
Yeah.
I forgot. So basically what it will be just a combination of different articles and topics that are happening right now, not only in the homeschooling world, but, in Christian education, generally speaking, across Australia and the world. And the first one I wanted to dive into was an article on news.com.au talking about the surge in homeschooling, which most people are aware of if they're looking into it, and that being driven by bullying concerns, academic dissatisfaction, and a desire for alternatives. So, families are reporting that it's having a really good impact on the child's mental health. But then in this article, an expert was warning of the social and the resource trade-offs, right? Which I thought was really interesting. Now, the bullying, that's one thing. I mean, bullying's been around forever. I do think it is worse now than it's ever been in the age of social media. Socialization, that's the number one thing I think most parents bring up with homeschooling.
Yep.
My short answer to the socialization thing, which this expert in this article is saying, well, they're missing out on that. And there's all those opportunities that students need to learn in social interactions. Yes, that's true. But in the homeschooling world, I think a lot of the perspective, and my perspective is, well, we actually just get to choose who our children socialize with. So, we actually don't have to worry about sending them to somewhere where the influence will be so great from other families within that community that might not share your values on a lot of things. And that actually being a lot more drastic in its impact on your child. Whereas, taking them out of that situation and giving them a home education, you essentially just look for those opportunities to socialize, and you have more control and say on who those children are that your children are spending all their time with. So I think that's a really important counter, that you actually just you have the choice to pick who your children are socializing with, essentially. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is one that we get all the time. And I've got so much to say on it. Because it is one of the main counter arguments to homeschooling. And the bullying on the first part, I remember as a kid in, early high school asking my mum to homeschool me because the bullying component was more than I wanted to endure. And, when you think about it, kids shouldn't be having to be putting up with any form of bullying. And unfortunately, at that point in time, it just wasn't an option. And sure, there's character building and shaping that was happening for me. But it's not one that was pivotal enough that I'm now a new person. I needed to go through that too. I definitely did not need to. So that's one thing. But the whole being able to from a socializing, pick your own sort of contacts and people and yeah, 100% true. So so I used to teach typically in single sex schools, mainly all boys schools. And one of my main counter arguments was, what about the socializing? And at school, year 9 boys hang out with year 9 boys, right? That's it. That's their friends. That sure, they might, have a couple in year 10 or a couple in year 8, but typically year 9 boys hang out with year 9 boys. And you're stuck with that cohort and you're moving all the way through. And, some great long lasting friendships probably happen there. But what I noticed, and the main thing that I noticed when I first, I guess, was exposed to homeschooling, I just finished university. I got sort of offered this job 1 day a week of coming and teaching music to homeschool kids. And my wife and I, Jennifer, had the same experience, but to teach drama a few years earlier than I. And we often joked around when we first got told, we're like, what's wrong with them? We're like, well, why are they homeschooled? We knew nothing about this world. And I'm like, some money in my pocket. Let's make it happen. The main thing that stood out to me was that boys and girls ages 5 to 18 with their parents there are interacting and playing and socializing, that the 15-year-old could include the 6-year-old, and the 6-year-old knew how to speak to the 14-year-old, and the 14-year-old could go respectfully to a parent and say, hey, look, Johnny's just not interacting very well. It was just this whole beautifully sort of environment that it wasn't about year 9 boys hanging out with year 9 boys. It was this socialization that kids knew how to interact. And soon after I started with that, got a job at my first school. And I just remember award ceremony, again, all boys school. A bunch of the boys struggled to walk up, look the lady teacher in the eye, shake her hand to get the award because there's just this awkwardness around, an adult female there if it wasn't their mum. And these sorts of things sort of that was the main thing that stood out to me. But the opportunities that I've been able to do with my kids in a social sort of environment, not only with other homeschoolers, but to be able to go, they've got their sport, they've got their swimming, they've got church, they've got youth group. My kids are socializing more than your kids that are at mainstream school because their hours are consumed, as we said, 35 plus hours. And then that's not even counting homework and co-curricular with the same sort of age group that they're socializing within a school setting. And it's in a learning environment where my kids are interacting socially, learning environment, and with a range of age groups.
And when you think about it from a school perspective, when they're socializing within their age groups, that doesn't reflect real life. You get into the real world and you realize, well, there's actually decades of time and age difference that you have to interact with and know how to collaborate and work with. So I think schools are actually doing a disservice in that area that, they hang out just with their own age. Whereas real life, that's not how it works. And, there can be a case made for, well, what about the homeschooling families where we went to something and they were all very awkward and no one knew how to communicate? Okay, I'm sure that exists, right? And so that's why it's intentional for homeschooling families to be intentional about what does our social life look like and how are we setting them up to succeed in different environments, whether that's through sport or the arts, whatever it is. Being intentional about finding those little outlets and avenues along with online. I know with our online community, I mean, they're always hopping on calls outside of their class times just to hang out and spend time together.
Yeah.
Or they're playing video games.
Yeah.
Right. And so
that's what my kids are doing. Like, I'm on a call. I'm like, oh, who is some kid from their class? Oh, what are you doing? Oh, we're playing Roblox, or we're playing Minecraft, or we're playing what? I was like, okay. It's like, don't forget, you've got this amount of time. We're like, okay. But yeah, it's nice.
So, parents need to be active in making sure that they're providing those opportunities where they can so that, they do get that wide range of age, because that's real life. School socialization isn't real life.
No. I think with that also just, you've been in schools long enough, as have I. You also get the awkward kid in school, right? It's not just it's homeschoolers, they're the weird kids. It's like, no, actually, we're everywhere. Like, I'll put my hand up, but like, I like weird things. It's just going to be by whose perspective or by whose standard. And I know that's another one of those sort of like, oh, well, if they don't have socialization or they don't have this or they're unique in this way, it's like, well, there's a beauty in that. And we'll save it for another episode. But, the achievements that I've seen in homeschoolers based on, these stereotypes is phenomenal.
Absolutely. And one of the last thing the expert, quote unquote, talked about was resources and the ability to have, trained teachers as opposed to parents. And I'll say this, parents know their children much better than teachers do, and they are the best person to teach them, right?
Yeah, 100%.
All the time. And it doesn't mean you can't partner with other people to help in that, but that relationship is so special and should be cherished. But that comes with this idea, well, the teachers know all the skills or have all the resources. Well, I can tell you, I worked in one of the highest fee-paying schools in Australia, and everything that the children had access to in that school, parents also have access to from home. And that's through subscriptions, different programs that are available to all. There's mysterious thing that, private school, what are they doing behind those walls? We've both worked behind those walls. There's nothing mysterious about it. Everything that they can do and access from a learning point of view online and digitally is accessible to everyone else outside now, more than ever.
Yeah, especially now. Yeah.
Especially now. And I tell that to parents. I said, these are the same programs kids paying $40,000 a year use in their setting.
Yeah.
So that's coming from two people working in that system.
Yeah, exactly.
Last article, which we've talked about, homeschooling being on the surge in Australia, across the world. Various programs, particularly in North America, we're experiencing up to 800% increase in enrollments, which is just astronomical. I know with our organization, we've seen up to a 500% increase in enrollments recently. And it's just something that is shifting globally. And, I think the question is, will this continue to grow? I think yes. I actually think that it's only getting started.
Yeah, that's it.
And what the government's responses will be, I guess we're starting to see a little bit of that. They're noticing that trend.
Yeah.
But in one article, somebody was saying that they reckon they believe by 2035, approximately 1.4 million K-12 students will be enrolled in particularly the classical education program, and that can include homeschool co-ops, online schools, micro schools, Christian classical schools. But you're talking about millions and millions of kids and families opting for this alternate education because of what the other system is not providing them, which is huge. Huge. So it's certainly a trend that is growing, and I think will continue to grow. So if you're sitting on the fence with those decisions, just know there's a big movement happening. It's not just this small micro part of each state that's having a little bit of a heyday. It's happening globally. Yeah. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of our second episode. Thank you so much for listening. And if you're enjoying the show, please like, subscribe, share the episode. And next week, episode 3, we are going to be looking at what school forgot to teach. So we look forward to it, and we'll see you then.
All right, see you then.